Hello, everyone. Welcome to this month's Deacons on the Road to Emmaus. We've got a chance tonight to learn from Don Burr about the story of the Hungry Soul Breakfast, and we'll be able to learn some of his recipes for success. But to get us started, let us have Don give us a prayer to launch our night together.
Lord be with you.
And also with you.
Let us pray. Heavenly God, when I have food, help me to remember those without adequate nutrition. When I have work, help me to remember those seeking employment. When I have a warm home, help me to remember those without a permanent place to stay. When I am without pain, help me to remember those who suffer. And remembering, help me to quiet my complacency and move my heart and hands to serve. Make me concerned enough to help and empower others to do the same by word and deed, those who cry out for what we take for granted. Amen.
Amen.
Amen. Again, I'm Julie Lytle. I'm the Executive Director of Province 1, and this program is jointly sponsored with the New England Deacons Network and the Episcopal Province of New England. What we've done is offered an opportunity for deacons who are both active in their ministries as well as preparing as postulants and candidates to be able to join together and share stories about their ministry, learn from one another, help celebrate the successes and learn from some of the challenges, and be able to move forward walking together as we figure out how to do God's mission in the world. And so Don's going to be sharing his perspective tonight. He's currently a postulant in the province's School for Deacons. And so we're glad to have him be a part of this experience and share some of the story of how he got into the ministry that he's launching. Don, can you take over?
Thank you. Well, this evening, I think we'll break this up into three pieces. As far as our agenda goes, I will talk a little bit about the history and background of the Hungry Soul Breakfast. I will offer our recipe for success, and of course, we'll share. And by doing that, let me say, just as we did in the beginning here, we began and ended with prayer each time we met. So we've already begun the recipe here tonight. So back on Christmas Eve of 2010, I was waiting for, in between services actually, waiting in the vicar's office. We were chatting about all manner of things and realizing that it was just before 11 o'clock, and at that time of night, each night of the year, there would be about 50 to 60 men who were coming in from the open door shelter of Norwalk. They would come in and sleep in an overflow situation in the parish hall at the church, Christ Episcopal Church in East Norwalk, Connecticut. And that ministry in itself began with, hey, the good folks at Christ Church, can we bring some folks over who need a place to stay on the coldest nights of the year? And then the coldest nights turned into a little bit more, and then it evolved into every night of the year. And this went on for probably a good 5 or 6 years in itself. And interestingly enough, it wasn't until the conclusion of their time staying overnight at the church that this first conversation occurred. So the vicar and I were chatting, and you know, I said, I hear the guys downstairs coming in, and we never see them, we never hear from them, and quite frankly, they don't necessarily hear from us. Perhaps they prefer it that way. Perhaps there's a preference to the anonymity of coming in and staying overnight and leaving quickly in the morning. And yet, it struck me as ironic that it was Christmas Eve. We were preparing to worship someone who came looking, whose family came looking for a place to stay, and there was no room for them. And there was no room for these fellows from the shelter, and they were here at the church. Well, that conversation led to a conversation with a few folks in the parish, which led to a conversation with the vestry. And on March 20th, 2011, the very first Hungry Man breakfast at the time, we hadn't yet evolved because it was all men at the time, took place, prepared, served, and operated out of the church kitchen, which is an industrial kitchen, certified industrial kitchen. So we were able to cook right there and serve the breakfast and share that with the residents of the shelter in the parish hall. As we did that 3 or 4 times, yes, I do. Sorry about that little side conversation. So we began with breakfast at the church itself. And the breakfast being served at the church itself was convenient because the men were already there, and the breakfast could be served right out of the kitchen. All right, now I'm on track here. So how do you serve 50 to 60 men whom you don't know their dietary needs, you don't know any restrictions? Where could we start? Well, we began by going down and having a conversation with the director of the shelter and so on. And that conversation led to him explaining to us that the hot breakfast program had been cut from the shelter for the weekend. And sometimes even during the week there was no hot breakfast. So this all made sense. This all came to be out of a need, not a perceived need, but a real need. Well, how do you do that? Well, in an operation like this, it's a low overhead operation because everyone can participate. So what it began by receiving gifts at the altar. Everything from the pans to the eggs and the cheese and the juice were collected at the altar and blessed with the rest of the offering that came in each Sunday. The shopping was done by a different group of people. So there were people that could be specific about their giving with special envelopes earmarked for the Hungry Soul Breakfast. There were folks that did the shopping at the grocery store. And it's a simple recipe, and there's a down in the bottom of your page, there should be a document that you can download that has the recipe as well as the original recipe that we started with. And then we get to the kitchen. And you end up with a team of folks. That first night, interestingly enough, there was some pushback. Have you ever undertaken a ministry that had some pushback? Well, I'm not sure that we need this. I'm not sure that we want to do this. Well, the sound is breaking up from me. Are you not able to hear me?
I can hear.
You can
You're
hear?
fine.
Okay. Matt is reporting that the sound is unintelligible. I'm not sure what's happening. So where was it? Oh, pushback. Although there was some pushback and some skepticism as to whether anyone would participate, there were 50 to 60 men in the parish hall sleeping, and there were 14 people in the kitchen working. So those folks were folks who had been part of the congregation on a regular basis all the time. There were folks who had not been active necessarily and somehow felt moved by the Spirit to be part of this ministry. There were students from the school where I was working at the time, and so we came together and made that first breakfast. And that first breakfast, we didn't have this recipe as the only thing. We went overboard and were making pancakes and waffles and all sorts of things. That first night, we came short of offering omelets, made to order. But that first night, we did want to be prepared for the unknown. Dietary restrictions, who can have meat, who wants meat, whatever the case may be. And so there was plenty of breakfast food and fruit and other exciting things. There were cookies that were made, and some of the fruit actually, let's get out of the kitchen here, but some of the fruit, let me tell you now, and I'll mention it again later, was fruit that they could take with them. Now, you start with this very easy recipe. You chop everything up, you throw it in a bowl. And this young man, by the way, I'll just tell you, this guy started out cracking eggs. He needed a job that day, and he was prepared, and he became the master egg cracker. You will see over the years him age in these photographs, and he stuck with it through thick and thin times. Sometimes it was a small group of folks in the kitchen, and other times it was a larger group. You'll see in the photographs in the kitchen the repeat of folks that were there, and then every once in a while we would end up with a group that wanted to participate, whether they came together or not. And this was a group in these photographs here from Build On. Have any of you ever heard of this? This is an operation, a high school and college program that is a service learning program that runs out of many high schools. And so they came from my high school, and here they were doing their homework while they were working, and wanted to be part of it. So they wanted to decorate little cards to leave on each of the trays for the guests who would be served. And every contribution, everything that goes into the offering plate, everything that goes onto the breakfast plate, all of it is part of the gift, and all of it is part of the important contribution that is made that day. So within a short amount of time after the breakfast began at the church location, the shelter was going through a bit of a turmoil in terms of one, not being able to adequately house the people and meet the need, and also some internal staffing issues. And so one of the things that we learned and tried to address by this direct service, direct delivery, was that unfortunately some of the things that were being given to the shelter, some of the the offerings that were made, food and otherwise, were going out the back door. So this, by making the food, shopping for the food, making the food, and delivering that food to the table, it was to ensure, in part, that everything that was given was shared with the folks whom it was intended for. Now, one of the things that we did over the years was refine the recipe. By finding this Hungry Soul recipe, we were able to include pretty much all the food groups. You know, you had your dairy, you had your meat. We would make 2 or 3 without meat because that was a concern for some, especially because it was sausage very often. And by having all of the ingredients there, you could have a full meal on a plate and not have to bake it that morning necessarily. So there was a time where we worked through this and had the preparation work the day before. The youth group would come in, or whomever was working in the kitchen, they would come in, they would cook and mix and prepare everything and cook it and then put it in the fridge, and then the next morning at 4 a.m. we would show up to bring that over to the shelter. And as our system evolved, it became even more streamlined, and we would prepare the ingredients and then not bake them then. We would bake them the next morning at the shelter, because then you didn't have to thaw them out in the morning and put them in the oven and deal with all of that. And it made so much more sense. But a wholesome meal that absolutely you could serve at any gathering. Now, we talked a little bit about sharing. We all have opportunities to share the ministry with others and encourage others to be part of it. One of those ways was to serve the casserole at coffee hour. So when you talk about coffee hour conversations and having an opportunity to share what's going on, well, not only sharing what's going on in terms of information, but sharing the food. And people seem to embrace the idea of food. We're Episcopalians. We like everybody, like food. But to be able to make that connection, to make that connection and share the story and share the dinner plate, the breakfast plate. So we would do all of that preparation in the morning or the day before, and then in the very early morning when before the sun was coming up. It always was dark by the time we arrived at the shelter. I missed that point. I started to say that before. For a short time we were at the church, and then the overflow situation changed, and they didn't need to have the overflow at the church anymore. So we said, well, gee, what are we going to do? And we went a whole summer where we didn't have something else, or they weren't ready for us to come and serve the breakfast. So we sat around one morning at a diner and said, well, gee, what can we do? There must be a need. And of course, there's that tendency to search for something and to search and go by perception rather than what's real. And so we talked to the folks at the shelter. We talked to the operations manager, and he said, well, gee, we could use some help with back-to-school supplies and things for the kids. And so for that summer, that's what the congregation worked on. And then by fall, we were back to the Hungry Soul breakfast. And at that point, we were serving it at the shelter. So we would get up and meet at the church at 4:30, pack all the supplies into the back of my truck, and then we would go from the church over to the shelter and meet up with other folks that were working, and they would come in, and we would get to work underway. The fresh fruit in slices we had on the plates, on the trays, and then we would have whole fruit that could be easily tucked in a backpack or a pocket or something like that to make sure that there was a snack for lunchtime. Because not everybody, from what we understood, not everyone came back to the kitchen for lunch. And everyone got into the kitchen. It was a very small kitchen, which really we only needed about 4 or 5 people, because some of them were teenagers. They were a little smaller, so we counted 2 for 1. But everybody got into the game. And there, because it was a more controlled kitchen environment and we knew what to expect, we were able to do things like make French toast to go along with it. The tray would be, something that any diner would rival. And the residents, it was really so cute, because the residents would see one of us that they recognized and say, "Oh, the people with the really good hot breakfast are here." It was cute. It was really nice to know that they remembered. That they remembered the breakfast, that they remembered that someone cared, and cared enough to make something other than government eggs and cheese. And there were times when the chef would say, "Well, if you run out of eggs, I have the liquid eggs in the fridge over here, so we'll be all set." And we would assure him that we had an extra crate of eggs out in the truck already prepared to go, that we didn't have to go that route. It would be some pretty high-end product. And some of the food came in from parishioners. Other folks from the community would drop off food or connect with me or someone else to bring food in that could be part of the recipe for that month. This was a monthly breakfast for a time. And then as schedules changed for folks and folks got a little bit more limited in their mobility, they chose to do this every quarter. So we had about 4 times a year. And it was realistic for what we could do in the size congregation that had this. And we did everything, and no matter how many people you had, there was always a job for someone, whether you were making French toast or you were making coffee or orange juice or whatever, or you were rolling the silverware. This is actually such a critical piece of keeping the flow going. I mean, if any of us have ever worked in any sort of an operation where we're trying to keep the food hot and the customers happy, just roll everything up in a nice little napkin, and you can put them in those little cardboard boxes on the counter, and you'd lay them out, and you could store them. You could do those ahead of time. If we had extra people that showed up the day before and there was not enough room in terms of serving in the kitchen or cooking in the kitchen, there would be people that would be wrapping those up, and sometimes we had cases of silverware all wrapped and ready to go for the next month or two. And as you can see, again, very small kitchen. It was okay if only, this is one of those ministries where you're okay if only 4 people show up, and you're not disappointed, because it means that you might not get jabbed in the elbow, get an elbow in your side while you're cooking. But as I mentioned before, the breakfast casserole, French toast, bananas, oranges, and one of the parishioners would make banana bread at home and bring in. She would freeze them and then thaw them out the night before and bring them, and they would be part of the table. And that is another one of those items where it was something that we don't always get when we're in a setting like that on our tray. Some of you may know, and I may have talked about it in conversations, others may not, that I used to lead a group of young men every Wednesday afternoon. We would watch movies and we would talk about life. And one of the movies that we watched, we viewed, was The Pursuit of Happiness. Have you seen the movie? Yeah. Will Smith and his son, and one of the scenes in the movie that struck the guys to the point of actually, can we stop the movie? Can you pause the movie for a minute? We have to ask you a question. And there's a scene in the movie where the father, Will Smith, is going there to the shelter, and the line is around the corner, and he gets all the way up to the front of the line, and there's not enough room in the shelter. And all right, sorry, we have to cut off here. And they paid attention, the guys paid attention to the fact that in the movie it described that shelters were not built, and very often shelters didn't have capacity to house single fathers with children. There's a setting for single moms with children, but the family situation didn't always provide. And so that moved them to some real heartfelt thinking about, well, gee, why is that? Why does that happen that way? And as it turned out, that conversation right there, I had explained that the parish where I worship on Sunday mornings, that there's an overflow situation, and the guys come to the church and sleep there, and that's how the connection was made between the young people from the school coming and working as part of the breakfast program, because they wanted to understand what was happening. And they asked, and gee, if your parents are going to drop you off at the church at 3 o'clock in the morning, go right ahead, come on over and be part of the fun, because it's a beautiful experience, and it was. So for a number of years, all sorts of folks. We operated regularly for about 5 years, so 5 years total, and then a number of our principals would tell me that they had to have surgery. So one was having a hip done, and one was having a knee done, and the other was having their shoulder done. So their mobility was more significantly limited, and they would not be able to continue for a while. So the program currently, the ministry is currently on hiatus. It started out as a missional experiment, if I can borrow a term from Bishop Douglas, and grew into what I knew as the Hungry Soul Breakfast. Perhaps it will continue in the future. At this time, we're on a bit of a break, and every once in a while, someone will shoot me an email and say, well, what's happening? And I'll shoot the email back that says, I don't know. What are you going to do? You can see the casseroles in that slide there, stacked on the top. The recipe that you can download from that link there has the single casserole recipe if you wanted to make the casserole for yourself, or it has the yield of 12 casseroles, which serves about 150 people if you slice it up right. And, oh, I forgot about that. Somebody made pancakes that morning. what was interesting about the group that were really the principals of the Hungry Soul Breakfast was that it was the group from the 8 o'clock worship. When we would gather in the kitchen to prepare, the day before there was prayer. When we would gather in the morning at the shelter, we would pray before we began. And then folks would run home. We would leave the shelter by 7:30, and some would go directly to worship, and others would run home and change their shirts or whatever just so they didn't smell like a cafeteria. And yet we would get back to worship at 8 o'clock, and Father Frank would be so excited because he would say, at announcement time, I just love it on Hungry Soul Sundays because you all smell like a diner. Diner food. He really enjoyed it when the food was being cooked at the church because it would come up through the floorboards. The kitchen was directly underneath the altar, so the smell of the cooking and casserole. And I'm sure there was some residual leftover aroma of food. Teachers, these two are teachers from the school, and so they really loved the idea. And the kids would sometimes, challenge the teachers. Well, I'm getting up at 5 o'clock in the morning to go to breakfast. Are you going to be there? And they would. So sharing. So if you're with any ministry, the idea of getting other people involved, isn't that what deacons do? The idea of getting other people involved is something that's critical. It's critical to getting our message out. And so what we did was we had these very simple foam core boards, and we set them up at our diocesan convention. Had the breakfast tray out there, had some apples for people to come by. Some people give away candy at their booth, but we went with apples. We had the recipes that with the little recipe link that we're all trying to work with now. We had that there, and had an opportunity to view some of the slides. I had the laptop, and yes, I did have candy off to the left, but folks were pleasantly surprised when they came by the booth and saw apples out there. So I think I may have reached the end of the Hungry Soul slide. Yes, I have. When we engage in a ministry like this, are we not reminding those who engage in the ministry with us that when they are serving those at the table, they are serving Christ himself? And so I look forward to an opportunity to chat with you all and answer any questions. I hope that I've covered things. I must tell you that I'm a little distracted by all the little boxes and things like that. So if my conversation has been a little sketchy, I promise I'm better at preaching than I am at doing this. So have I covered everything? Do we have any questions? Julie, what do you think?
Well, there was a story that you shared of one of the more meaningful experiences that you had that I'd love to hear you share with the rest of the folks.
I think you're talking about oranges, naranjas. Did I say that correctly? Naranjas in Spanish. One of the first mornings of the breakfast at the church, what would happen is, because the van from the shelter was limited, it was one of those 18, 15 passenger or whatever vans, so they could only take a certain number of people at a time. Folks would kind of move their gear to the corner of the room, put away their cots and so on and so forth, and then they would we would all set up together the tables and chairs for breakfast. And in the evolution of that activity, what would happen is that some folks, in particular folks that either weren't ready to wake up at 6 a.m. for breakfast, and what we found later, folks that didn't necessarily want that kind of breakfast. So one of the young men that was from the school, the tiniest of them all actually, he was working with me at one point, and I said, Gene, would you please take these oranges and see if anyone would like to have them, because they're all looking at me like they don't want anything that I have on this tray. And he said, well, Mr. Burr, it might be because they don't speak English. And I said, okay, well, give it a shot. The tray was cleaned off within minutes. My understanding from him was that it's not a heavy breakfast. Culturally, it's not necessarily a heavy breakfast is served. So the fruit was something that went and was well received, as well as the whole fruits that went out afterwards to be taken along for the journey. But what a profound yet simple thing is that I needed somebody else. It couldn't be just about me or someone else trying to feed somebody that didn't want to eat what I had, and being open to learning, because we can perceive all sorts of things, and sometimes we're wrong. Did I cover, is that the one you were talking about?
Exactly. I'm sure you all have had experiences similar to what Don is sharing, and I'd love to see what questions you might have from your experience to share with him that can enliven this conversation. Does anyone have an aha or a question?
Don, it's Bonnie. Did I excuse me? Did I see that you served the people the trays as opposed to a cafeteria line type of a serving situation?
It took place both ways. At the shelter, what we learned, we tried initially to work by serving directly to the table and bringing out a full tray. And so there was a learning curve for us in terms of that, because the ups and downs of that are you get there with a whole tray, and they really the guest really is only looking for fruit, or only wants French toast, and isn't interested in the fruit. And the custom, I guess, at the open door shelter is a cafeteria line at the window. My first inclination and my learning was to try something different than what was the custom, and serve at the table. It worked both ways. I think more smoothly probably in the cafeteria style, because you could order what you wanted when you went to the window. And yet, having folks go out and serving the trays at the table allowed for a bit more of a personal interaction, which for me, I mean, we're all about building relationships. It's great to feed people, but if you don't know who you're feeding, sometimes you've only prepared half the recipe. You left something out of the recipe. Linda, I can't hear you.
Hear you. you might need to type into the chat, and I can repeat the questions for Don. I'm just typing away.
All right, I see. Elaine, are you trying to talk as well? I can't hear you. I'm sorry. Okay. Some people did try to, I see Linda's question asked about any thoughts about sitting with the guests and really having a relationship. Some of the folks that worked the breakfast did on occasion try to develop more of a relationship with folks, or at least start a conversation, strike up a conversation. Some relationships were grown from our time in this ministry. And other times folks were really, it was early, you know, we've just been rousted out of bed and now we have to have breakfast. I mean, that's what happens in that setting. There's a time for breakfast and there's that window of time for breakfast. You come here between this time and this time and you can get a hot meal. But if you arrive afterwards. So feeding that many people is tough from a management standpoint. Sometimes there were opportunities for relationships. I see a number of the folks that have been served over the years out in the community, and every once in a while they'll look at me and, you know, there's a fellow by the name of Guy actually, and I recognize you. Where do I recognize you from? And I said, we've had breakfast together at least once. And he says, you know, I specifically didn't say, oh, you know me from the shelter. We've had breakfast together, you know, at least once. Oh, yeah. A number of the men specifically have come to be part of the congregation. However, regularly or irregularly, there were a couple of fellows that were coming a few years ago that we haven't seen in a while, though I have seen them out in the community. Whenever that happens, I always worry, though, you know, what's happened. And occasionally I will call the shelter and ask the manager if the person is okay, if the person that I'm recalling is okay. One man specifically has become an integral part of the congregation, and so much so that there were 3 spots on the vestry available last year. And in the Australian method of, you know, numbering 1, 2, 3, and 4, he was the 4th name out of 16 people. He was the fourth person chosen to be part of the vestry out of like 16 names that were floated that day. So this can be for some transformative on both sides of the tray, both sides of the table. I know it is. I know it was for me and for others that I've worked with over the years. Was there time? What was their time for them to be out the door? We would finish about 7:30. We would start at 6. We would finish about 7:30, where we would leave, but they were still able to eat, I believe, until 8, and then they would the habit at the shelter was to kind of clean up and everyone had chores. You know, everyone who lived regularly at the shelter would have an assignment, and that would rotate. So every once in a while, somebody would come in and be you know, emptying the trash or coming in and getting supplies from the supply room. And so there were opportunities to meet other people in that manner as well, because, you know, you get a little, it's close quarters in the kitchen. They're a place for the women to have. What's that?
You shifted the name from the Hungry Man to the Hungry Soul. Was that because women were involved?
Well, remember that we began by serving the folks who were there for the overflow, and at that time it was just men. And the recipe, the original recipe, if you look at the link, there's a link on the bottom of the recipe itself, and that shows that it was the Hungry Man casserole. That's what I found online. I was looking for a breakfast casserole, and that's what I found. And so that's actually how the breakfast got its original name. And then once we got to the shelter where everyone was being served, then we felt it only appropriate that it would be the Hungry Soul casserole and the Hungry Soul breakfast. And so that's where the name shift came from, yes.
Catherine shares the story that for about 20 years her church was doing dinners quarterly with the Salvation Army, and that they were specifically asked not to sit with the guests that were there. And if somebody did happen to sit down to build the relationship, they were reminded they shouldn't be. That seems like a stark contrast from your experience.
Interesting, Catherine. Was there a specific reason given for not developing a relationship?
Linda's sharing that at their church without walls, they think that they should sit together, and was wondering why as well.
Yeah, the ministry at the cathedral in Hartford has folks sitting with with guests. You know, you're encouraged to sit with the guests, if I'm not mistaken. Is that right, Bonnie?
Yep, and have conversation. Whether you are at Church by the Pond or if you are at Church Straight Eats, relationship is encouraged.
Sure.
And frequently, it's a difficult thing. People on both sides of the table are unsure of unknown relationships, and they're hesitant to talk, or they're fearful of letting their own souls show through. And it takes some encouraging.
Vulnerability can be a difficult place.
Yes, and there is vulnerability on all sides.
Both sides of the tray.
Catherine's identifying what was probably some of the root issue was the psychic or psychiatric stability of some of the guests and the liabilities that might go with that, with insurance issues. Did you get into any of those kinds of questions as you were developing the Hungry Soul breakfast?
I have to tell you that we did not. It was almost as if, in many ways, we had been given. I would come short of saying free reign, but if you're going to come and serve breakfast, and that's what you're about, then by all means do what you need to do. At the same time, being aware of not to cross a boundary where you're imposing on someone. As from my perspective, I'm going to your house to have dinner, and I just happen to be bringing the pizza. And I'm not necessarily going to tell you where we should sit and how we, and whether we should have wine with our dinner or milk. So I think that we tried to be careful not to impose on someone else's dining room table. If there were folks who would come to the kitchen door and chat with us, who would come to the kitchen door and tell us how lovely the meal was and how thankful, and there were folks that would come to the door and bring an offering. Take this. I know it's only a few dollars, but I want it to go toward the next time you come back for breakfast. Wow.
Linda's offering that at loaves and fishes. Some folks sit, but they always ask first, is it okay if I sit next to you?
Yep.
And I'm curious, do you have any particular training for the volunteers in terms of ways to approach the others that are there or ways to engage in the conversation?
I'll be honest and tell you that we really didn't get into the conversation. I do have to say, though, that 90% of the, well, no, I wouldn't say 90%. 90% of the adults that ever worked the program had worked in education. So whether they were teachers from my school or from another school and happened to be members of the congregation or what have you, they've got experience in boundaries, so maybe that was why it wasn't necessarily a subject that ever came up, but probably a subject that should be discussed for the very reasons that that Catherine brought up, in terms of, in some places, it's best not to do that based on norms and protocols. It would kind of go against what I would think would be important, because as we've, many of us have mentioned here now, relationships are critical. Relationships are encouraged, appropriate relationships are encouraged. And yet there are insurance issues that I'm sure all organizations deal with. In Safe Church, we're not giving somebody our phone number, call me, or whatever. And then again, Linda says maybe we are. Linda, you asked a question earlier about is there a place for the women to have breakfast? At the shelter specifically, everyone dines together except the families. The families have separate quarters that are away from the rest of the guest population. Now, that said, moms would come to the kitchen window and seek a meal, and depending on who was in house at the time, we would know we got a package of a series of we'd send whole casseroles back rather than piecemeal. Send whole casseroles back with a bag of oranges and a bag of apples and whatever, to feed the whole family at a time. And different moms would come back, or they would come out and say, well, I'm picking up breakfast for everyone that's back there, and we have 10 people back there today. So if you're watching somebody else's kids because they're at work, then you're taking care of their breakfast for them too. And it was an opportunity for people to sleep. Yes, you could. I see this other part of your question here. Yes, you can come and have breakfast. You don't have to stay overnight. You can come to any of the meals. Some of the guests of the dining room were folks who live elsewhere and are housed and need food.
Catherine's also mentioning that sometimes they took dinners with milk, and that people were often very excited because they typically had coffee and Kool-Aid, and it was something kind of different. Do you find any of those kinds of experiences?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. When you're cooking, the chef from the Open Door Shelter, one of the chefs was on one of the cooking shows, and I'm trying to think, I'm blanking on the cooking show that he was on. But in order to cook for that number of people every night or every afternoon or all three meals every day, 365 days out of the year, they have to become quite creative. So, Steve could make a pot of tea, and when he's making a pot of tea or he's making coffee. He's making coffee in a 30 or 60 cup urn, and things are maybe not as fresh. We can heat that up for the next day. Things like the liquid eggs, the liquid eggs, the blocks of cheese that would be creatively cut because they didn't have a meat slicer, to cut the cheese on a meat slicer for sandwiches or what have you. Kool-Aid was a staple when we weren't around. There were stacks of cans of Kool-Aid. So yes, absolutely. Milk. The milk was powdered milk in many instances, and we would bring cases of gallons of milk and juice and things that would provide food that we might have on our plates at home. And yes, exactly, Catherine, that people were excited because it was food that, as I said before, one of the things that we were trying to address is the fact that the hot breakfast program was cut. We could have done a dinner. We could have done lunch. Well, you don't have the staffing or whatever the resources, so perhaps we can help you in this way. And the shelter appreciated it as well because it allowed for them to put some of their resources at least once a month or once a quarter to put their resources elsewhere because of their own budget cuts, because we were there. Dinners and milk.
It seems like in your conversation, Don, that there's been some ebbs and flows to the actual ability to offer the Hungry Soul breakfast. How does that feel when the hope is to have something that's ongoing in longevity, but that there must be some stops and starts that bring awareness to differences in how you do ministry when you can't always have it running the way you thought? Can you comment about that?
There were times when, in terms of overhead, it was always pretty well funded. So in terms of stops and starts of funding, we really didn't suffer from that. Stops and starts of people who were available. When you're looking at a ministry such as a breakfast program or lunch or dinner and a meal ministry of any sort, there are people that get sick. There are people that have to work, and the gem about this particular kitchen that we worked out of is that, again, the work could still get done by 4 people. It was great if there were 8, but we could still work with 4 people pretty smoothly. And so there were only a few times where we were that concerned. And then it just meant a few phone calls to get folks to be part of it. Now, with the hiatus that we're talking about right now, in part of my formation, I have recently stepped away from regular leadership in my home congregation. So when the time comes, should the time ever come that someone expresses an interest in picking up something like this before, I would be happy to be part of helping that get off the ground. Yet it's not something that I can directly be involved in at this time. It's sad in terms of sharing my insights about how I feel about what may be stops and starts. It went consistently for 5 years, and sometimes it's okay if something concludes. One of the things that we talk about here in Connecticut is the idea of missional experiment that we try them for a time and they work, and then there comes a time when they might need to stop. And this is one of those times where at least we're on a break. Does that address your question, Julie?
Certainly, and I think that's part of the challenge we all face, is that when we feel very compelled to make sure something happens and want to give it life, to be able to know when we need to step back, and if it can continue to flourish, that's fabulous. And if for some reason it can't, you know that its time will come when its time will be. Trusting that God provides and that people come forward to do what needs to be done when it needs to happen.
Yeah.
But that's for me, that's hard to let go of sometimes in ministry.
No doubt. And to you know, there were times when you know, when I would think, am I going to be, you know, the food is already prepared. We never really had trouble getting folks to serve it in the morning. Sometimes it was who was going to mix up the casseroles the day before. And there were times when I felt like, well, it might just be me, or it might be me and my wife, or something. And you know, sometimes we came pretty close, and then somehow the Spirit just moved folks to be part of it, and they were there. And this is that time where the Spirit is taking a breath and saying, it's all right. And if its time comes again, then it will. I do need to pause for a moment and tell you that through the magic of television, my friends, bring that up a little bit more. Can you see this casserole here? Just came out of the oven. Breakfast is ready for tomorrow morning. Thank you to my lovely assistant from the kitchen.
I leave my house by 5, so if you can have it here before, then it would be good.
Look at that. Steaming hot. There it is. Oh, I don't know how to work this camera thing. There we go. You see, it's got everything in there. You got peppers and potatoes and cheese and sausage and cottage cheese. It's cheddar cheese and cottage cheese. And the shredded potatoes, they make up almost the crust. So it's really yummy. And this smells delicious, and I think I'm having some for dinner.
That's great.
Well, anyway.
I'm afraid I have somehow frozen. So if there aren't any other, are there any other questions on the screen, or anyone else that has a comment? Don, I want to thank you profusely for sharing your story of the Hungry Soul Breakfast. It's obviously a ministry that's had a great impact in your community, and it looks like, as Linda's saying, she'd like to take it to the outreach committee at her cathedral in Springfield, that it's got a chance to have life beyond where you have been. So thank you very much for being able to share your story with us. I'd like to remind folks, thank you. I'd like to remind folks that next month we're going to be preparing for the end of life. On March 16th, there'll be an announcement going out in about a week that will give you more details on how to log in. We are going to be moving from Adobe Connect to Zoom. So you'll see things looking a little differently and hopefully have a little easier way of connecting and getting audio and video working. So we're going to try it next month, and hopefully that will work well for everyone. And as always, feel free to be in touch with me if you have a story you'd like to share, or if there's a person you'd like to recommend as a person we could capture on screen to share their ministry with the rest of us. So again, thanks. If you don't mind, I'd like to close us in prayer. So take a moment and take a breath and pay attention to all that is quiet around you. Oh, loving God, thank you for the gift you have given us of time to share our stories. to celebrate the ministry Don has had and to learn from him about ways of reaching out to those who are hungry and those who have less. We ask you to continue to bless us all in the work that we do to serve you and your kingdom. And we ask for the continued vision to be able to have companions on the journey so that we can do your mission in the world. We ask you to be with us and are mindful of the ways in which you always are. Thank you, and in Christ's name we pray. Amen.
Amen. Thank you.
Good night, everyone.
Thank you.
Have a great President's Weekend, and we'll see you next month. Enjoy.
Thank you. Come by for breakfast tomorrow morning.
Okay.